Hello, I'm Marty Stone, a sole practicing transportation consultant after retiring as the Chief Operating Officer for Aegis Projects USA and the former Planning Director of the Tampa-Hillsborough Expressway Authority. I'm joined today by Ed Regan, a senior consultant with CDM Smith, and for more than 30 years, the leading U.S. authority on toll traffic and revenue, and Bob Poole, Director of Transportation Policy and the Searle Freedom Trust Transportation Fellow at the Reason Foundation. For over 20 years, Bob has advised the U.S. DOT and half a dozen state DOTs on transportation policy and helped introduce a number of policy ideas into transportation, including long-term toll concessions, hot lanes, and dedicated truck-only lanes. This webinar, Paying for 21st Century Interstates, is a follow-up to our recent Toll 101 2021 update about the coming gas tax crisis and its effects on funding for U.S. transportation. Today, Bob will be talking about using per-mile tolling to modernize our interstate highway system and what we need to do to convert from the gas tax to per-mile user fees. Ed will be discussing the big picture of tolling the interstates, with a look at what tolling actually means in terms of per-mile toll rates, and what he thinks we need to do to make this happen. And I'm going to present some ideas about how to efficiently collect road user charges and interstate tolls nationally, and the role of the federal government in exchanging transactions and settling the funds between the states. But first, Ed has a short review of our last webinar and the reason we're having today's discussion.
Thanks, Marty. Well, we'll begin our presentation today with just a quick recap of what we talked about back in May when we had the three of us got together and made a similar presentation on the problems with the gas tax as our primary source of transportation funding in America. We talked about the declining sustainability of the gas tax in the face of increasing fuel efficiency and the coming heavy shift to electric vehicles. You'll recall we talked about General Motors projecting it's only going to offer electric vehicles by 2035. And Ford recently introduced its new F-150 truck model called Lightning with great enthusiasm and interest, all electric. And by 2035, California, all vehicle sales will need to be electric or other non-fossil fuel. In essence, this all points to a growing need to find new sources of funding for transportation and an emerging emphasis on more direct user fees, such as tolling, and eventually broad road user charging. In case you missed it in May, here's a very quick recap of future fuel consumption and gas taxes. I won't go through the details. It's a complicated graphic that we talked about last time, but basically the upper portion of this chart shows a historical trends and forecast of nationwide U.S. vehicle miles of travel. And you can see through 2019, travel was increasing. We had a big drop in 2020, about 15%, due largely to COVID impacts and so on and so forth. And in the light gray part of this shows the Energy Information Administration's 2021 Annual Energy Outlook VMT forecast, which projects things will get back to where they were in 2019 in terms of total travel by about 22 or 2023, and up to about 4 trillion miles of travel by 2050. A relatively modest growth rate of just under 1% per year. But the bulk of the chart deals with estimated fuel sales. The lower 2/3 of the chart deals with fuel sales. And again, once again, we see the big drop off in fuel sales between 2019 and 2020. We have 4 alternative sets of projections shown here. The red line is purely hypothetical. It's what would fuel sales be in the United States if there was no change in fuel efficiency and no shift to electric vehicles. That's not going to happen. We put it in here basically for comparison purposes. And then there's 3 alternative forecasts, realistic forecasts. The green line reflects the EIA reference case for fuel sales in its 2021 projection that came out in February this year. And basically they've forecast that fuel sales will never again reach the levels we achieved in 2019. That may or may not be true, depending on how quickly we recover from COVID. But the reality is the long-term future of fuel sales is decline. We created another alternative shown in orange here that basically assumed restoration of some of the future CAFE mileage standards in the Biden administration. The EIA forecast in green assumed the reduced levels and targeted values by the Trump administration. And then finally, the blue line is the worst case scenario. That's with a high share of electric vehicle penetration, adapted from Bloomberg New Energy Finance global forecast. Drops off big time after 2030, basically drops down to about 130 billion gallons of fuel in 2040 and less than 120 billion gallons of fuel in 2050. And that compares with about almost 200 billion gallons of fuel sailed in 2019 and prior years. This chart shows the estimated annual federal fuel taxes from the gas tax. In 2019, that came in at about $38 billion. It dropped to about $33 billion in 2020 because of the COVID impacts. Here we have the three alternative forecasts in addition to the no change hypothetical. The big impact is estimated by 2030. We could see a 20% drop in fuel tax revenues strictly due exclusively to increasing fuel efficiency and the onset of electric vehicles. That's projected to rise to about 39% in 2040 and close to 50% reduction by 2050 in the worst case scenario. That means we need a search for new sources of revenue in transportation. The most likely eventual outcome is road user charging, or RUC, the eventual shift from a per gallon to a per mile basis of user fees. Several states have conducted research and pilot demonstrations. This year's federal transportation reauthorization, the bipartisan infrastructure bill that's pending in Congress, increases funding for state pilots and funds research for a development of a nationwide road user charging system and a national pilot. Full deployment may still be 10 years away, but it's looking more realistic. Several states have implemented supplemental vehicle registration fees for electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles to replace the gas tax on fuel those vehicles don't consume. Pennsylvania recently announced plans to phase out its state gas tax, and a special commission recommended new alternatives, including tolling and including ultimately a shift to road user charging. A dozen states have looked at or considered adding tolls to existing interstate highways and bridges, but thus far, only Rhode Island has implemented tolling, and only on heavy trucks, to fund badly needed bridge reconstruction. Today, we're going to focus a bit more on tolling our interstate highways, recognizing the need for a threefold increase in funding for interstate system reconstruction and expansion, as identified in the TRB Commission report on the future of the interstate system. Bob?
As Ed reminded us, there's a serious looming revenue shortfall for all U.S. highways. And some of us have talked about for several years the idea of using per mile tolling on the interstate highway system as potential first step toward replacing per gallon fuel taxes with per mile charges. 12 states are actually looking into interstate tolling, either for replacing individual major bridges or for looking at the entire system, or at least all of the rural long-distance interstates, having done comprehensive studies of what it would cost and what sort of revenue would be generated. And they're doing this for a number of reasons. Revenue shortfalls is obviously a big part of it. And the long-term decline in fuel tax revenues, they're all, I don't think there's a DOT in the country that isn't aware of this. They know that as the most important and most expensive infrastructure that we have, the cost of rebuilding and widening aging interstates is going to be way beyond what their current projected revenues could possibly do. The major bridge replacements, some of them are getting underway now in states like Louisiana and possibly Alabama. And there's also the problem of congestion on the urban interstates, which variable tolling could be an easy fix for. So as an important background factor for all of this is that Congress in the FAST Act asked the Transportation Research Board to convene an expert committee to study the future of the U.S. interstate highway system. And their report, which came out in December of 2019, renewing the commitment to the interstate highway system, identified the magnitude of the problem. The report said that the interstates are wearing out, and most of them should be rebuilt in the coming decades. And that's something that most legislators, either federal or state, have been unaware of and still seem to be unaware of, despite this report documenting it pretty thoroughly. Many of these corridors also need widening. Projections of VMT may not be quite as high as they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago, But solid projections by federal highways and by state DOTs show that a number of these corridors, especially ones that are important truck routes, are going to need more lanes. Rebuilding the system, it makes sense to add the lanes where it's most likely to be needed. The TRB report estimated $57 billion a year for 20 years devoted solely to this interstate replacement modernization project. And that was all very valuable. But then they proposed a completely fanciful major replication of the original Eisenhower program, with federal government dramatically increasing fuel taxes and dedicating a huge fraction of them for 20 years to the program, and with 90% federal support on a pay-as-you-go program, completely ignoring bonding or anything like that. In my view, and I think a growing number of other people's, per-mile tolling is a far better alternative, particularly if you do long-term financing. Raise the money up front as you get near the time for a project. If it's charged per mile, a toll is a mileage-based user fee. And we now have all electronic tolling, which is much better accepted than any of the gadgets that are being tested in state pilot projects on mileage-based user fees or road user charges. And if the new per mile charge is charged instead of fuel taxes, it comports with the basic premise of all the state pilots that this is a replacement, not in addition to the gas tax. And it would demonstrate to people that DOTs are serious when they say that's what it's going to be. Toll financing also enlists bondholders as a safeguard on boondoggle projects, projects that just don't make a good economic sense. You can't possibly cover the cost, perhaps on some low mileage corridors. Bondholders also insist on maintenance accounts, as we know in Florida with all of our toll roads, that this is a way of insuring against large amounts of deferred maintenance, as happens on a lot of other highway systems that don't have this kind of protection by bondholders. And if a state shifted its interstates fairly soon to tolling, this would free up the remainder of all of their gas tax monies for all other highways and gives them some breathing space before having to cope with the problems of convincing people to charge per mile for all the other roads in the state. So as we talked about in the earlier webinar, persuading highway users that we need to make this change is a serious challenge. Sort of, I think, naive approach of state DOTs is saying, oh, well, there's not enough revenue. Well, that's true. But if that's all you talk about, it turns off taxpayers. And there's populist opposition to mileage-based user fees, I think, in part because of that perception. Another thing is the idea that if you start charging tolls now, and then 10 or 20 years later, replace a corridor with modern pavement and more lanes, people will say, well, how the hell do we know that any of these projects, all we know for sure is we're going to pay a bundle in tolls. We're not sure of getting any real benefits and improvements out of it. That is a losing strategy for what would be, let's say, once in 100 years change in how we pay for highways. The need is to instead to focus on customer benefits. And I've said this at conference after conference. Now, first of all, what are the obvious benefits for everybody who use a rebuilt interstate is today we have much better pavement designs. They don't require as much maintenance. So it means lower life cycle cost for the most important highways in the country. More lanes, particularly in truck-intensive corridors, will mean less congestion. And on urban interstates, we have the potential, as we've seen with express toll lanes, to use variable pricing to limit and reduce the amount of congestion. We could, if Congress agrees, have real service plazas on 21st century tolled interstates, as on all the existing turnpikes, where people can recharge their electric vehicle or fuel up with hydrogen if they need that, and can stop and have a meal and do all these nice things without having to get off the interstate and drive around in an unfamiliar place. And it has the potential, as discussed in the TRB report, for dedicated truck lanes in those corridors where the truck VMT projections make this a viable alternative. Now, some other benefits of a more customer-friendly approach to the policies of using tolls would be, as I mentioned earlier, no double taxation, which is the trucking industry's big concern about existing toll roads. They're paying fuel taxes and the tolls. And the tolls are supposed to be paying for the whole cost of those corridors. So the fuel tax is, they think, and I agree with them, an unfair tax. To avoid this, we need to give rebates of the fuel taxes for the miles driven. And we know how many miles are driven because of the electronic tolling system. And it's not that hard to have a lookup table in the software that takes the vehicle and the EPA highway miles per gallon and figures out how much state fuel taxes, since the fuel tax will still be in place under this scenario for a while, to give rebates of the state fuel taxes. The toll revenue would be dedicated to the capital and operating costs per the financing, whether it's through a toll agency expanding its remit in the state or through a long-term public-private partnership financed by the toll revenues. And the long-term P3 would also have further safeguards because this long-term agreement can build in protection of the revenue to not be diverted to other things. And one of the most important policies would be to not start the tolling until the corridor or a segment is finished with the rebuilding and modernization, so that people are only paying for value added, not paying for what they could think of as a pig in a poke that might never be there. Now, there's also additional benefits for truckers. Trucking industry already has, through one vendor called BestPass, a single universal transponder that works with, so they have interoperability if they want to subscribe to that particular service. They get a single monthly invoice for all the trucks in their fleet, all the toll roads they've used. And in addition, Massachusetts Turnpike and the New York Thruway are already providing trucks fuel tax or other highway user tax rebates for miles driven on those turnpikes. It's not a Bob Poole pie in the sky idea. It's something that's real in 2 states already. And the cost of toll collection using all electronic tolling and transponder accounts can run as low as 5 to 8% of the revenue. Dedicated truck lanes would be another benefit for truckers, helping them use longer combination vehicles and introduce platooning in corridors that are Jersey barrier separated from the regular lanes. And of course, the service plazas would be a huge benefit for truckers as the shift to alternative fuels for trucks comes along, and as we have a huge national need for safe overnight parking spaces for trucks. And that could be met by, partly at least, by expanded service plazas on the interstates. Now, it's also important to avoid counterproductive policies that would turn people off. And some of these examples are taken from things proposed by a few state DOTs, charging more to out-of-state vehicles than in-state. And I think Congress has very good grounds for prohibiting that as a violation of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Implementing tolls before improvements are made, which we've seen happen in a couple of places, like Washington State on the floating bridge. Charging only trucks, as Rhode Island is now doing, and yet everybody benefits from the improved highways, not just trucks. Having limited tolling points is an invitation to what we used to call shunpiking, or avoiding the toll plazas, when I was just out of school and working in Connecticut and commuting on toll or free roads. And states that ban P3 procurement would forego risk transfer benefits, such as protection against cost overruns being the obligation of taxpayers and things like that. So it's important to have good policies in implementing this. Now, Reason Foundation has proposed federal legislation that would enable this. It would expand the existing interstate toll finance reconstruction pilot program, open it to all 50 states, exempting them from the bans on tolling and commercial services at rest areas, but only if the state agrees to customer-friendly tolling provisions that would make it more likely they could actually accomplish this, get political support in the state legislature. Also, remove the $15 billion federal cap on tax-exempt private activity bonds, which have been used to finance the large majority of highway P3 projects in the last decade. Expand the PABS program to include brownfield reconstruction. Currently, it's been applied only to just greenfield projects, and the current legislation appears to only allow it for greenfield projects. And expand and streamline TIFIA, because if this program goes forward, there's going to be a lot more use of TIFIA for the low-interest federal loans as supplemental financing. And finally, to summarize the 6 customer-friendly tolling provisions, as I have been saying, tolls must be all electronic and charged on a per-mile basis. The tolls would be charged instead of state fuel tax, not in addition. The revenues must be used only for the capital and operating costs of the improved facility. The tolling would start only after a bridge or corridor is rebuilt and open to traffic, or a segment of a corridor. All vehicles would be charged, not just trucks, and same rates for a vehicle category like trucks or cars or in-betweens would be the same for in-state and out-of-state vehicles on very good federalism grounds. Now, obviously, this would be a voluntary thing that any state could try. And given the number of states that have looked into interstate tolling, I think you would find some early takers. The importance of this is the benefit of pathfinder states. If one or two states do this and succeed politically, it will open the door, I believe, to a lot more states deciding, oh, if we follow their example, we can get to yes on this. My experience over 25 years or so with managed lanes, starting in California with SR 91 and I-15 way back in the mid-1990s, demonstrated to people, DOTs and MPOs across the country, that they actually worked. And today we have over 60 priced managed lanes projects in operation nationwide. I think we could see something like that with toll-finance interstates. So finally, the advantages for starting the transition using the interstates. If all states ended up doing this, 1/3 of the total VMT, which is limited access highways, which means basically interstates and a handful of, urban expressways that are mostly interstates, 1/3 of total VMT. And that's a good start to the overall transition. It uses existing, very well accepted, easy pass transponder tolling. You don't have to have any kind of new gadget in the car that people might object to. Very importantly, it builds trust that the mileage-based user fee will be a replacement for fuel taxes, not an add-on. Gives state DOTs breathing room to figure out how they're going to charge for the rest of the roads while you're demonstrating and implementing it on the limited access highways. It's actually more equitable in the sense that the interstates and urban expressways are the most expensive to build and maintain of all the highways in the country. And most pilot projects all charge the same amount regardless of what road people are on. That's an understandable baseline assumption, but I think there's a lot of benefits to charging full cost recovery rates on the very expensive roads and not charging people who don't use those expensive roads with a rate that was higher than necessary for the roads they actually drive on. Finally, there's just a slide showing the report that Reason Foundation that I authored in 2019 that lays all this out in more detail than we can cover in this webinar. So I thank you very much and look forward to discussions and questions.
This is Ed Regan, and I'm now going to take a look at tolling the interstate system as a big picture. What if we tolled the whole interstate system? Bob mentioned in his presentation the Future of the Interstate Commission report from 2018 and 19, and I'd like to take a look at a couple of key highlights from that report that directly affect the question of interstate tolling. The current total annual investment in the interstate system is $22 to $25 billion a year. But of that, the federal share of that accounts for less than 45%, as compared with about 90% federal funding when the original interstate system was built 50 years ago. That's about 20 to 30% of total highway spending by the states. And it's only 2% of the roads, but it does carry 25% of the VMT in our nation's highway system. There's a compelling need to increase interstate highway system annual funding, according to this Interstate Commission report, by a factor of 2 to 3 times. The total annual investment needs to be $57 to $69 billion. That's an increase of at least $35 billion per year over today's levels in our interstate system. It also calls for Congress to increase the federal gas tax to a level needed to support 90% funding of the Interstate System Renewal and Modernization Program, which in the report they refer to as RAMP, R-A-M-P. And reports suggest that Congress should lift the ban on tolling of all lanes on existing interstate highways. The Interstate Commission report includes a blueprint for action, 10 recommendations. I want to focus for a minute on recommendation 6, because I think it's very relevant to our overall presentations today. To ensure that the federal government's long-term commitment to RAMP is not threatened by declining fuel tax revenues as the vehicle fleet and its energy sources evolve, Congress should prepare for the need to employ new federal and state funding mechanisms, such as the imposition of tolls or per-mile charges on users of the interstate highway system, right in line with today's presentation. So what level of tolls might be needed to meet interstate renewal and modernization? Well, Again, the report suggests at least an increase of at least $35 billion. That's in 2016 dollars. So assuming interstate tolling probably couldn't start realistically until 2025 or later. And I've increased that number to about 45 billion for purposes of our discussion today. That's the increase over current funding levels. It also projects total interstate funding at $57 billion a year in its mid-level projection. That's around $70 billion per year at 2025 levels. So what if the entire interstate system was tolled? Well, not going to be, but just hypothetically, let's think about that for a second. What if Congress, for example, established a toll on all currently non-tolled parts of the system, maybe as a replacement for the declining federal motor fuel tax? Nice idea, but not likely to happen. Or what if every state, individual state, decided to add tolls to its currently free interstate highways? Also not likely to happen, but many states probably will at some point. But this hypothetical full tolling scenario allows us to try to compute how much the tolls would have to be, how high the tolls have to be to meet those needs that were established in the Interstate Commission report. C.D.M. Smith developed a nationwide interstate tolling analysis tool for Federal Highway Administration a few years ago on a study we did for them. And it allows a look at revenue potential at different levels of toll on all interstates, excluding those portions that are already tolled, about 3,000 miles. We looked at 5 hypothetical toll rates for purposes of a little piece of research here, between 4 and 8 cents a mile for cars and trucks at 2.5 times that rate, which is probably a low multiplier, but basically truck tolls between 10 and 20 cents per mile rate. And these 5 curves here show the estimated projected revenue that would be generated over the first 25 years of operation, hypothetically between 2025 and 2050. We look at the red line, the lowest toll we tested was 4 cents a mile, 10 cents a mile for trucks. That would generate about $38 billion a year. Net revenue after the cost of collection on the full interstate system, rising up to about $50 billion a year by 2050. In the middle there, the green line, 6 cents a mile, that would generate about $52 billion a year, up to $70 billion by 2050, and higher rates for higher tolls. Could we just do it with the gas tax? Do we really need to do tolling? Well, this curve basically repeats what I said at the beginning of today's presentation. The outlook for revenue from the federal gas tax is actually going to be in decline. In fact, interestingly, by 2025, a 4 cent a mile toll on the entire interstate system would generate about the same amount of revenue as we could get from the entire federal gas tax on cars and trucks for all gallons of fuel consumed. So what would the average annual net toll revenue? Well, this chart looks at 25-year average annual between 2025 and 2050, estimated net revenue after the collection costs derived from tolling the whole interstate system, again, excluding those parts like Ohio Turnpike and Penn Turnpike that are already tolled. And it basically ranges from about $43 billion at 4 cents a mile average annual revenue, all the way up to close to $80 billion a year average annual revenue at 8 cents a mile. And by the way, the green portions of these bars reflect revenue from cars or 2-axle vehicles and trucks and other vehicles with more than 2 axles, the blue parts of the bars. How does that relate to the need? Well, as we said before in Congress's report, they said we need to increase funding on the interstate system after adjusting the 2025 levels to about $45 billion a year. We could just almost do that with our 4 cent a mile rate, definitely could do it with a 5 cent a mile rate. But if we wanted to basically fund the entire cost of the interstate system, including ongoing maintenance and ongoing rehabilitations after the initial rebuilding, we're looking at a cost of $70 billion a year nationwide. Well, that could be accomplished with a toll of about 7 cents a mile. We also tested a hypothetical additional 4 cent per mile charge in urban areas, about 15 to 20% or so of the interstate system VMT. That would be assessed an additional charge, just cars of 4 cents a mile. Theoretically, that could be used to generate funding to pay for urban transit subsidies and things like that, or managing demand, congestion, and so forth. Right side of the chart here shows the revenue if we add on that orange component, that additional surcharge. And basically, you can see that with that surcharge, a 6 cent a mile toll, certainly no more than a 7 cent a mile toll, would pay the full freight for the next 25 years or more. At per mile rates, just a quick little comparison, the rates we tested for intercity car rates on rural facilities, 5, 6, 7 cents a mile, right in the middle of what the current toll rates are that are charged on facilities like Ohio Turnpike and Florida Turnpike and Kansas Turnpike and so forth. On the truck side, we're actually on the low end. The rates we tested at 12.5 to 17.5 cents a mile are on the low end of truck rates that are already charged on these intercity kind of regional turnpike systems. And then with the extra 4 cents a mile for cars in the urban areas, I compare that in this chart with other urban toll facilities, such as projects in Texas and Florida and so forth, urban expressways. Here we're comparing 9, 10, or 11 cents a mile. And you can see we're at the very low end just about of rates. In other words, urban tolled expressway rates are much higher than others and much higher than the rates we talked about in this study. Now, to be clear, specific rates needed for any individual state or specific route in a state would be different. They would vary by individual states. And that would depend on if the interstates needed to be widened or bridges replaced, and it would depend on traffic levels and all kinds of other things. But it's reasonable to assess that the overall average car toll rates to support full future interstate system funding would likely be in the broad range of 5 to 7 cents per mile. Not that excessive. Certainly not excessive, especially if motor fuel taxes were eliminated on fuel consumed while driving on tolled interstate routes. Basically eliminate the notion of double taxation that has been an argument against tolling for many years. Bob Poole has proposed, for example, rebates of gas taxes for miles driven under tolled facilities, such as tolled interstate facilities. Currently, the state and federal tax is equivalent to about 1.8 cents per mile for cars, about 7.2 cents a mile for trucks. So if those were eliminated for the miles driven on tolled interstate highways, that would make them even more financially viable. Just a quick look here, Florida interstate tolling revenue potential, and we all think there's nothing but toll roads in Florida, but the reality is there are over 1,400 miles of untolled interstate highways in the state, excluding those with just express lane. I'm talking about tolling all the lanes on a facility. Really only Alligator Alley on I-75, the southern portion of I-75, is on the interstate system. Things like the Florida Turnpike and other facilities are not typically part of the interstate system. In that particular case, especially if we include in this urban 4 cent a mile supplement on cars, the revenue potential of tolling Florida's interstate highways would range from about $2.5 billion at the lowest toll rates tested to about $3.7 billion. Reasonable number to assume, if we charged mid-level toll rates on the entire Florida interstate system, it would generate, after collection costs, net revenues of about $3 billion per year, average for the next 25 years. So, good idea, right? Interstate tolling makes a lot of sense. So how's the idea of tolling interstates been doing? Not great. At least a dozen states have considered adding tolls to existing free routes. 3 or 4 are actively looking at it now. Oregon might be the closest to deployment, but we'll see. So far, only Rhode Island has actually deployed tolling on interstates, and it's limited the heavy trucks to fund badly needed major bridge reconstruction. The Interstate System Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Pilot Program, the old ISRRPP, been around for more than a decade, almost 2 decades. 3 slots that would enable tolling states to come in and toll an interstate route retroactively in their existing states. 3 states applied and received slots. None ultimately deployed interstate tolling under this program. Why so few success stories? I think it's less about federal limitations and restrictions on tolling interstates and more about political reluctance and public acceptance at the state and local level. In terms of public acceptability in general, surveys over the years have found a little bit more support for increased use of tolling than increases in gas and other tax levies. Notable exception, of course, trucking industry, which strongly favors gas tax increases. As an example, CDM Smith, in a study we did in 2017, did a survey of over 1,400 drivers on I-95, toll-free road, I-95 in Connecticut. And among a lot of other questions, we asked for reactions to 2 statements from people in the survey. I support the use of tolls to pay for highway improvements. 59% agreed with that statement. 41% disagreed. But when you compare that to the other question we asked, which I support new or increased taxes to pay for highway improvements, only 34% agreed and 66% disagreed. So clearly, there's actually almost a public support for the notion of tolling. So why have we not seen it happen? If interstate tolling is such a good idea, why has it been such a tough sell at the state and local level? I think back to a presentation I made 25, 30 years ago to ARTBA P3 conference, one of the first conferences they had. and I entitled the presentation A Tale of Two Questions. If the question is, would you prefer this to be a toll road or a free road? Almost everyone would prefer it to be a free road. But if the question is, would you prefer a toll road or no road? Most would select the toll road option over no road if they believe that that's the only way they'll be able to get the new enhanced travel option with tolls. While tolling may be the most viable option to fund badly needed improvements to interstate highways, they are today considered to be or perceived to be free roads. The challenge is with perceptions and messaging of interstate route tolling. Most interstate routes are at or beyond their design life. So if they're fully reconstructed and expanded, they are essentially new roads. But will they be perceived as new roads by the public? That depends on how dysfunctional or heavily congested they're becoming. The key is to clearly identify what future conditions will be, with and without the improvements and with and without tolling. What will the benefits of rebuilding be? What are the consequences of not rebuilding? I'm going to wrap it up today with what I consider to be 6 keys to enhancing public and political acceptance of interstate tolling, particularly at state and local level. First, tolling initiatives should be focused on specific needed improvements, bridges or roadway segments or specific corridors or groups of corridors, but not just as a general new source of revenue. Second, the need to evaluate and communicate the specific improvements needed and the long-term consequences of not making the improvements, the possible future degrading or worsening of conditions, and the potential loss of access if a bridge collapses or whatever. Third, quantify and communicate the driver benefits of the enhancement project, such as savings in typical travel times in the near and longer term. Fourth, communicate a realistic assessment of funding options and when the needed improvements can be completed under each option. Tolling is likely to greatly accelerate needed improvements and bring user benefits sooner. For example, get it done by 29 or 30 as opposed to 2045 or 2050. Fifth, effectively communicate true information about toll charges. Opponents of tolling have been notorious about making up and communicating and exaggerating how much tolls are going to cost people. Express tolls in cost per mile and typical trips in the corridor. And then finally, a commitment to undertake and complete the project if a tolling program is approved and deployed. The bottom line, when it comes to gaining state and local support to toll interstate highways, the public and elected officials need to fully understand the benefits and true cost of adding tolls, both today and in the future, and the true cost and consequences of not making the improvements that would be enabled by tolling. Thanks very much.
To implement replacement or augmentation of the fuel tax, and to make this fairly seamless for out-of-state drivers, no matter if it's adding tolls to interstate highways or conversions to other approaches to road user charging, I believe we need to deploy some type of national system to oversee fee collections and distributions between the states and to include transaction exchange and financial settlement. So we're going to do a short overview of some issues with fuel tax and electronic toll collection, and then talk about goals for such a national system and what I believe is a proper role for the federal government in this process. So let's take a quick look at some critical issues and misunderstandings with fuel tax collection and tolling that would impact such a national system. A key study to compare the cost and effectiveness of fuel tax collection versus all electronic tolling was undertaken almost 10 years ago by Darrell Fleming under the direction of Bob Poole. In 2010, regular gas was selling for a national average of about $2.86 a gallon. As you can see, about 14% of that was federal and state taxes, and the cost of crude oil was 71% of the price. One of the first myths generally held by the public, but dispelled by the study, was that fuel taxes were collected at the pump. They are not. Each state is responsible for collecting the federal and state fuel tax based on their own internal processes, most of which involve collection of the tax at the wholesale level. They then report monthly to FHWA, who directs the amount to be collected by the IRS, and they also identify the amount to be distributed back to the states using the formula set by Congress. The study identified some critical issues and drew some important conclusions. First, it identified the actual cost of fuel tax collection as somewhere between 1.5% and 5%, and it could not be any more exact because of leakage that occurs in the tax collection process. That is, the difference between reported gallons sold on the retail side and gallons collected on the wholesale side. Also, there is a significant opportunity value because the flow of funds is not real time. The cost of AET collection was estimated as between 10 and 25 cents per transaction, or 5 to 8% of the revenue collected. And this could not be more precise because of the lack of uniform standards, accounting and audit rules and procedures in the U.S. from region to region, state to state, and agency to agency. But the study also anticipated that the toll industry cost of collection would significantly improve over time with the centralization of activities offered by AET and the adoption of more consistent practices. So let's take a look at what really happened during the past decade. As you can see, by 2018, the average price of gasoline at the pump had changed very little, though it had fluctuated quite a bit over the 8-year time span. However, the makeup of the cost of gas noticeably changed. While the federal fuel tax remained the same, many states increased their taxes to the point that the percentage of total tax grew. The cost of refining, marketing, and distribution all reflected the impact of slow and steady inflation, but the price of crude oil decreased substantially. Related to the study results and predictions, there was virtually no change in the process and cost of motor fuel tax collection. For the toll industry, we saw big strides in regional toll interoperability because of the development and implementation of the NIOP Committee's Uniform Business Rules and multi-protocol readers and transponders. However, toll agencies and interoperability hubs continued to procure and deploy one-of-a-kind back-office solutions from proprietary providers to manage their accounts and exchange transactions within and between the states. Tolling's continued use of the individual back-office model, supported by unique account management systems and proprietary operations vendors, has resulted in no reduction in the cost of electronic toll collection, and in some cases, even higher costs when you look at the new collection contracts generated by state DOTs and independent toll agencies. So how does this translate into a set of goals for some type of national system to exchange and settle user fee transactions in support of replacing federal and state fuel taxes that will likely still be identified at the state level? First, I believe, just like we did within the Toll Interoperability Committee, we need to leverage the tremendous investment of hundreds of millions of dollars in roadside and in-vehicle technology already made at the state and local level. We also need to understand that this investment is relevant, even when looking at the supposed efficiencies and lower costs that are sometimes assumed for GPS and telematics-based technologies. For example, when looking at the German GPS-based truck tolling system, there's still a huge technology and back-office investment required to support the collection of the revenue, and a major investment in roadside infrastructure to support the enforcement of the business rules that includes physical gantries, antennas, readers, controller equipment, and cameras, very similar to what is used for electronic tolling. The use of GPS is not about saving money on infrastructure. It's about better identification for road users and implementation of fees within their unique business rules and enforcement of those rules on trucks as they pass underneath the gantries. This is also true of other RUC and mileage-based systems. There is a tremendous investment in onboard technologies and back-office systems and costs related to customer service no matter what the approach. And they all have some type of enforcement, even in places that are changing from roadside tolling to GPS, such as in Singapore. The GPS-based system on the right side of the screen is replacing the ETC approach that uses traditional transponders. But they'll still be using the ERP gantries for enforcement to help identify those that may not have the new GPS package in their vehicles. The point is that many of the road user pilot projects and studies in the U.S. are using very different business rules, different technologies, and much different rates. And along with tolling, they all require some type of back-office system and support to process the fees, manage the accounts, and exchange transactions. No matter what the rules or technologies, all or most of these activities must be undertaken within the back office, and this piece is the element driving the high cost of toll collection that must be addressed if we are to have a national user fee system with costs acceptable to the states and the federal government. To make this happen, we must have some type of central clearinghouse with a set of uniform operating rules capable of processing extremely high volumes at very low unit costs. This approach should also allow states or independent toll agencies to employ any technology to identify vehicles, and they should also be able to submit files in any standard IT format as long as they contain the basic information required by the clearinghouse. I believe these goals lead us away from the toll industry approach that uses unique central software as the basis for a one-of-a-kind back-office system. For a cost-effective national clearinghouse, we should employ the proven commercial trading partner systems utilized by the banking, retail, healthcare, and credit card industries to securely process extremely high volumes, upwards of 100 million transactions per day. And this type of clearinghouse would allow states and agencies to submit transactions in their native format, with the ultimate cost at or below the cost of collecting the motor fuel tax. To make this happen, especially if it involves any new tolling on the interstates, I believe we need to involve the Federal Highway Administration. I'm suggesting something similar to the roles FHWA and the states now play for the motor fuel tax. The states are responsible for collection of the gas tax within each state. It should be the same for states instituting interstate tolling and RUC. And this model for using different technologies within different geographic areas has already been proven in Europe between Germany and Austria. Geographically spaced between Eastern and Western Europe, these are essentially pass-through states for heavy trucks who travel back and forth through these two countries, never stopping for fuel, thus paying no tax for the road capacity they use or the damage they are doing to the infrastructure. Germany and Austria both implemented truck tolling schemes, but with far different technologies. Germany uses a GPS-based system, and Austria employs a traditional DSRC tolling system. And both have been very successful, and they have coexisted for many years. But they needed a third-party approach to exchange the transactions. This is not unlike the U.S., with pass-through states like Rhode Island, Louisiana, and Oregon, and many others. However, it will be difficult, if not impossible, for the states to organize and operate a national central clearinghouse. This is the perfect role for FHWA, to set up and implement guidelines, pricing caps, and exchange rules using some type of guaranteed payment model. Oversight of the clearinghouse operations, dispute resolution, revenue distribution, reporting, and auditing. This is a perfect role for FHWA under the direction of Congress. But also to improve coverage and cash flow, it's important to encourage participation of the private sector. So any public or private organization that manages accounts and makes payments should be eligible to participate in the clearinghouse, as long as they are willing and capable of meeting the requirements and rules. This will open the door for true national transportation accounts that could support individual toll and transit systems, as well as state road user charging schemes and any implementation of new interstate tolling. At this point, we'll be happy to have discussion and answer questions.